Hi, welcome back to Psychology as a Human Science here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the second one in a series on phenomenological psychology. In the previous video in this series, we took a look at pure phenomenology, which is to say the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl, and we more or less went through some of the features of pure phenomenology, and then I tried to give you a sense for how revolutionary it really is to inquire into the nature of reality as we experience it from the point of view of consciousness and looking for the essential structures of consciousness, which is basically what the project of pure phenomenology is all about. In today's video, we're going to take a look at what I called the second mode of phenomenology in the previous video, and it's going to have to do with something called existential phenomenology. Okay, so there's the phrase in your notes in big block letters, and it has to do with interpreting everyday experience in order to reveal its underlying meaning or structure. Now, I slowed down on that phrase, interpreting everyday experience, because I want for you to hear how different that is from something like trying to intuit the essential structures of consciousness. Okay, so intuiting the essential structures of consciousness, that's the project of pure phenomenology. Interpreting everyday experience in order to reveal its underlying meaning, that's more the project of existential phenomenology. So the question maybe in your mind is, what's the difference between reflectively trying to intuit the essence of consciousness, the difference between that, and interpreting everyday experience? Well, one way to think about it is that interpreting everyday experience in order to give a rendition of its meaning is in a way a less ambitious project than trying to fathom the essence, as it were, of consciousness. So interpreting everyday experience means that existential phenomenology is just going to be trying to give a kind of rendition, as it were, of its meaning. Okay, so it's, in a sense, less ambitious, I think would be not a bad way of thinking about it. Okay, so let's take a look at probably the three most famous thinkers in the tradition of existential phenomenology. Okay, so first one is actually historically Edmund Husserl's protege, and his name is Martin Heidegger. Okay, so there his life dates. He lived kind of a long time, much longer than the average thinker in the existential tradition did. But at any rate, so the big emphasis on Heidegger's existential phenomenology is the central construct is going to be being, for sure, throughout all of his works. And because he lived a long time, he wrote over many decades, but the central thematic is always being. So here's another way of distinguishing pure phenomenology from existential phenomenology. In pure phenomenology, the central construct is always consciousness. All right, so remember, once again, we're intuiting the essences of consciousness in pure phenomenology. In existential phenomenology, sometimes it's consciousness, but a lot of the time it's not. And in Heidegger's case, it's definitely not. He doesn't talk about consciousness as such much at all. It's always about being, and consequently, one way of describing his version of existential phenomenology is in terms of a phenomenological ontology. Ontology, of course, is the traditional philosophical study of being. All right, so a kind of phenomenological ontology, in other words, reflectively looking at our everyday experience, trying to interpret it, important word, in a particular way in order to give a kind of rendition of its meaning or significance. All right, so an emphasis on exploring being, which he views in terms of, now here comes a technical German coinage, Dasein. Okay, Dasein. So Heidegger is all about Dasein, especially the early Heidegger is all about that. Now, I gave you sort of the most common way of glossing what Dasein is, and it's in terms of that hyphenated phrase, being in the world. And I'm trying to say it as though it's all one word, as it were, and not four words. Being in the world. That's meant to be, in a way, one singular expression. In other words, the reasons why there are hyphens in the phrase is to suggest that our being and the being of the world are interwoven and intertwined. And that's what this word Dasein is getting at. In German, actually, the coinage Dasein is a kind of portmanteau word in German, and consists of sein. Sein is the infinitive form of the verb to be, so sein means to be, and da means there. And so in a way, Dasein is to be there, and the question is, well, to be where? And the answer, of course, is to be in the world. So Dasein means being in the world. So he's going to be doing this kind of interpretation of everyday experience in order to illuminate the essential structures of Dasein, all right, being in the world. And of course, hopefully you're getting the idea by now that this talk of Dasein is meant to suggest a fundamental unity of subjectivity and objectivity. And if you're getting that idea, it's like, hell yeah, you're getting the right idea. Okay, so the subjectivity and objectivity are seen as fundamentally interwoven, so much so that really what we call the objective side of life is just seeing life from one particular aspect, and the subjective side of life is just seeing it from a slightly different perspective. But the fact of the matter is that objectivity and subjectivity are always interwoven within the larger lattice of life as we know it. Okay, so, all right. So his most influential work, I thought that probably you should at least get a little bit used to knowing the titles, the famous titles of these works, because probably if you stay here at the program in West Georgia, you're probably going to hear these now and again. So it's probably good at this early juncture in your training to get a little bit of orientation with respect to the names of these thinkers, because you're probably going to hear them again if you stay here, and their most famous works. So his most influential work by far, Sein und Zeit in German, right? So in English, Being and Time, published in 1927. Okay, well, that's almost 100 years. I guess 93 years at the time I'm making this video. So Being and Time, it's interesting. It's a little, usually I don't expect undergraduate students to be reading Being and Time. Usually that's more for graduate students, because books in existential phenomenology tend to be pretty thick and challenging and intimidating if you're not used to reading philosophy, for sure. So if you want to pick it up and try it, you can, but it might be best filed under the don't try this at home unless you're a graduate student category. So Being in Time, two big translations. You know, students tend to prefer the later translation, which was made in 1996 by Joan Stambaugh, yeah. And they tend to prefer that one. I tend to prefer the earlier one, which was made in 1962 by McCory and Robinson. But hey, it's a matter of personal taste. Anyhow, let's move on. JeanPaul, how do you say this guy's name anyhow? Well, for people who are English speakers, there are usually two different ways people say it. JeanPaul Sartre is one way, sort of retaining the R-E, and JeanPaul Sartre is the other way, sort of dropping the R-E. Now, the French is more like Sartre, where there's this sort of like Sartre kind of gurgly noise at the end. But that tends to be difficult for English speakers, so English speakers usually either retain the RE or drop the RE. So JeanPaul Sartre, I sort of grew up with the RE, so I'll just retain that. But Sartre is also very common. An emphasis on exploring consciousness. So here consciousness, again, reemerges, this time within the ambit of existential phenomenology rather than pure phenomenology, especially with respect to, for Sartre, the issues around our freedom and responsibility. Okay, so those are two things that are interwoven with each other. To be free from an existential phenomenological Sartrean point of view is to be responsible. To be responsible is to be free. So once again, it's a unitary phenomenon. All right, so he spends a lot of time in his most famous work, which is Being and Nothingness, 1943. Okay, so if you're keeping track of the timeline, wow, okay, so that was written 16 years after Being in Time. So I bet that Sartre sort of had exposure to Being in Time and then came up with his work, big work, this time 800 pages long. He was prone to a certain prolixity, shall we say. Being in Time is about, what, like 353, it's not that long, it's about 350 pages, something like that. All right, so, but Being in Nothingness is definitely a tome, so about 800 pages thereabouts, 1943. And yes, he was influenced by Being in Time to a certain extent. If you were taking the course in Existential Psychology, we would get into some of the details about that, but that's a little bit too much for this class right here. This class is supposed to be more like a smorgasbord, as it were, of different ideas and thinkers and vocabulary. So let's sort of leave it at that. Big emphasis on freedom and responsibility. These are big existential motifs for sure. Okay, and finally, the third thinker in this triumvirate of existential phenomenological thinkers would be Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Okay, so I sort of said his name in an odd way because Merleau-Ponty is a hyphenated name. So if you want to refer to this guy, say Merleau-Ponty. Okay, so don't just say Merleau or just Ponty or something like that. All right, so Merleau-Ponty. There are his life dates. He didn't live quite so long. So, okay, the big thing about Merleau-Ponty, and this is something that in our brief tour of phenomenology and phenomenological psychology, you may have detected is sort of missing so far from our account, and it has to do with embodiment, the phenomenology of embodiment, because it seems real obvious that the body, the physical body, is an important intersection point where subjectivity and objectivity meet and coincide and flow through each other, and for sure it is. So if you want a phenomenological account of being or consciousness or whatever, any construct like that, reality, at some point you're going to have to grapple with the issue of corporeality. In other words, the issue of our embodiment, our being embodies, and provide a phenomenological account of that. And that's what Merleau-Ponty is most famous for sure. He thinks of it in terms of what he calls the body subject. Okay, the body subject. And the thing about the body subject that's going to make it really different from a purely objectivistic account of our bodies, because there's obviously an objectivistic account of our bodies. In fact, you learn about it in elementary school pretty much when they, those days when they were teaching you the different sort of bodily systems that ultimately constitute the body. So there's a skeletal muscular system, and there's a digestive system, and there's a nervous system, and there's an endocrine system, and they told you about all these different systems. Yeah, that's an objectivistic account of the body. The body is an assemblage of different components and different systems that work together to produce physicality as we know it. Well, from a phenomenological point of view, the body is also a meaningful relation to world, a meaningful, ongoing, unfolding relation to world. Okay, the body is inherently expressive. And it's expressing its relation to world all of the time. So that's what makes this body subject idea different from a purely objectivistic account, which probably you heard somewhere along the line in elementary school or junior high or somewhere when they were telling you about all the different bodily systems. Okay, so his most famous work, The Phenomenology of Perception, 1945, and you may notice that, wow, that's only 2 years difference between Being and Nothingness and the Phenomenology of Perception. And moreover, if you remember a little bit of history, big stuff going on in Europe during the early 1940s for sure. In other words, World War II. Okay, not to put too fine a point on it. And if you sort of think about this lineage, wow, you know, these three big famous works were all written within an 18-year span. That's not a big historical span. And yeah, Existential Phenomenology, definitely doing big guns right about then. 1927, of course, was between the two world wars. So, you know, Nazism hasn't risen up by that point. Hitler attained the Reichschancellorship in January 30th, 1933. Okay, so It was before that for sure, and after World War I for sure. Okay, at any rate, let's get to the last little bit of material here on phenomenological psychology. And the last little bit has to do with drawing a distinction between phenomenological philosophy and phenomenological psychology. So the question here is, what is the difference? By this point, you probably already know, I'm guessing you already know, that, well, phenomenological psychology takes up a lot of the findings of phenomenological philosophy and applies them to the essential task of psychology, which is, in some sense, to understand the human psyche. Yeah, I'm glad you already know that. That's awesome. So the question is, what else? What other differences are there? Okay, so phenomenological psychology is going to be taking the methods of phenomenological philosophy and applying them to questions of particular interest to psychologists. That would be the first difference. So if you're doing phenomenological philosophy, it would be very uncommon to be examining the phenomenology of different states of psychopathology, like different categories within the DSM, right? That would be very uncommon for thinkers in the phenomenological philosophical tradition to be doing that, but it's very common for thinkers in phenomenological psychology to be doing that. So they'll be asking questions like, what is the experience of getting over a drug addiction about? Like, what are the essential features of doing that, like going through rehab or what have you? Or they might be asking about what is having a psychotic break like, and asking about that from the point of view of people's experience of it. Okay, so thinkers in the phenomenological philosophical tradition are hardly ever doing things like that, asking about different states, different kinds of experiences that are of particular interest to psychologists. Usually they're more interested in sort of the foundational type questions, like what is the phenomenology of time, or the phenomenology of the body, like we saw in the case of Merleau-Ponty, questions that are more sort of foundational. And phenomenological psychologists tend to ask questions about more the particularities of people's experience of different kinds of things. All right, so that's the first thing. So the emphasis, the kind of emphasis would be what we're getting at here. All right, so phenomenological psychologists have a more psychological emphasis. I know, big shock. I know, right? So anyhow, phenomenological psychologists also tend to take a more empirical tack, in a sense. In other words, they tend to go out and ask people in the world what their experiences are of different things, and then apply some kind of research method, like we saw in the case of humanistic psychology a little bit. All right, they tend to apply a research method to try to understand people's experiences of their descriptions that these psychologists have gone out and asked people about. All right, so that's a more empirical tack, right? Phenomenological philosophers, on the other hand, tend to, their project tends to be more sort of sitting themselves and reflecting upon experience and then writing about it. So it's a more individual, sort of internal affair, as it were, whereas the phenomenological psychologists tend to go around asking people about their experience much more. So that would be another difference. And like I said at the end, phenomenological philosophy tends to be more the product of individual reflection. I've kind of already said that. And now to sort of put the last little insight into this video, this distinction is not an absolute rule. Okay, so sometimes thinkers in phenomenological philosophy will go out and ask other people in kind of an empirical way. And sometimes thinkers who are more phenomenological psychologists will actually sit there and reflect on their own experience and then write about it. But the general rule still tends to apply. So don't take this as an absolute, is kind of what this moment in the video is all about, right? It's just a general way of describing the different emphases within the project of phenomenology, whether it's a psychological approach or more of a philosophical approach. Alrighty then, so this brings us to the end of this video, and this brings us to the end of your stuff about phenomenological psychology. Okay, it's a very brief whirlwind tour I realize that, but once again, the point of this class is not to give you an in-depth rendering of all this stuff, right? It's to give you sort of enough so that you can orient yourself and ask yourself maybe the question, is this something I might be interested in later in my studies here at West Georgia? And if so, you can start to gravitate toward that and take courses in it. That's what the whole point of this particular course, Psychology as a Human Science, is about, for you to start to figure out what you're interested in and what you're not. If you're going to be interested in phenomenological psychology, for sure you have to have a pretty avid interest in philosophy, and you have to not mind reading kind of dense, often difficult philosophical texts and talking about their ideas in a fairly technical way. So if that's something that you like, wow, you might start to explore this a little bit more. If that's something you dislike, you need to run, not walk, away from phenomenological psychology, because believe you me, we're only touching the tip of the iceberg here in this class. So if you have a repulsive reaction to the last two videos, it's like, yeah, you probably need to move somewhere else and go some other path. If you're attracted to this kind of stuff, it's like, oh boy, if we got something for you. All right. But in any case, be wondering about what you like, what you're hearing about what you like in this class, and what you don't like, because that'll help you fulfill the deeper purpose of this class, which is to figure out how you want to move within psychology, and maybe in an implicit way, how you want to move more generally in life. Well, why not? In any case, have a great one. Take care.